millionaire marries his gardener's daughter in a contract marriage as debt settlement. But nothing prepares him for how much he fell in love with her. Before we get into this story, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoy millionaire romance and love stories, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one when it drops. Now let us begin. In the quiet of the morning, Jonathan Moore, a millionaire dressed in a bathrobe, sipped his lemon water in his grand dining area. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room filled with luxurious dining chairs and dark oak furniture. He set the glass down on the mahogany desk and picked up a letter. The garden outside his study was lush and green, and he could hear the birds in the distance. But it was his gardener, Henry Williams, who lingered in his mind. "Henry," he called sharply, raising his voice just loud enough to reach the door. Seconds later, Henry, an old but still capable-looking man in his late 60s, entered the study. His hands were worn from years of hard labor, his shirt a bit weathered but still crisp enough for the morning. He stood at attention just inside the doorway, awaiting his employer's orders. Jonathan eyed him for a moment before speaking. "Henry, I need to ask you a question." Henry, standing at attention, nodded and replied, "Go on, sir. What would you like to ask me?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the smooth leather creaking slightly as he adjusted himself. He set down his glass of lemon water and clasped his hands together, his sharp gaze directed at Henry. "Henry, I'm looking for a watch," Jonathan said, his voice smooth but purposeful. "It's a very expensive one, gold with a black leather strap. A Rolex, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Have you seen it anywhere?" Henry stood in the doorway, hands clasped behind his back. He thought for a moment, his brow furrowing as he considered Jonathan's question. "I haven't seen it, sir," Henry replied. "As a matter of fact, I haven't stepped into the main house in months. My duties are out here with the garden. I come in, take care of the plants, and then go home. I don't even go inside, so no, I haven't seen any watch." Jonathan looked at him closely, his expression thoughtful, then leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Henry. "I'm going to need you to think very carefully," he said, his voice a little firmer now. "Try to remember if you've seen the watch. It holds a lot of sentimental value to me, and it cost me a fortune. So think carefully, Henry. Have you seen it?" Henry stood still for a moment, the weight of Jonathan's words settling over him. His brow furrowed in thought as he considered the question carefully. Henry's gaze shifted slightly as he thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I haven't seen the watch, sir," he said, his voice steady. "I would know if I'd seen any watch at all, and as a matter of fact, I haven't worn a watch in years." He paused, glancing at Jonathan, then added, "Sir, if that would be all, I'd like to get back to the garden. I still have a lot of work to do." Jonathan's expression darkened, and his voice grew harsh. "It's quite unfortunate that you lied, Henry," he said, his tone now visibly angry. "I was hoping you would tell me the truth, and I'm so sad that it has come to this." He fixed Henry with a stern gaze, the weight of disappointment heavy in the air. Henry's voice trembled as he tried to defend himself, his hands shifting nervously at his sides. "Sir, I didn't take any watch," he said quickly, his words coming out in a rush. "I promise I don't know what you speak of. Sir, I swear on my life, I didn't take the watch. Sir, what are you accusing me of?" His eyes darted to the ground, then back up to Jonathan, searching for any sign of understanding. Jonathan remained still, his expression cold and unreadable. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took another deliberate sip from his glass of lemon water, the movement slow, as if savoring the silence. He looked at Henry quietly, his gaze steady and unwavering, his anger now simmering just beneath the surface. The tension in the room was palpable. The once luxurious dining felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Henry could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his breath shallow, and the sweat beading on his forehead. Fear clenched at his insides, and despite his attempts to remain calm, his eyes betrayed his panic. He had never seen Jonathan so upset, and the weight of the millionaire's silence felt like a heavy burden pressing down on him. Jonathan, on the other hand, sat back in his chair, his face hard, his anger still flickering in his eyes. He felt a deep sense of betrayal. He had trusted Henry, a man who had worked for him for years, and now he felt that trust had been shattered. Jonathan's muscles were tense, his jaw clenched, but he didn't speak, he simply waited. His anger was slow burning, and with each passing second it grew stronger. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, his voice taking on a cold, calculated edge. "Since you want to play it this way, Henry," he said, his tone sharp, "we are going to play it this way." Henry's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the weight of Jonathan's words, but before he could react, Jonathan reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small CD plate. He slid it into the laptop on his desk with a deliberate motion, his eyes never leaving Henry's. "You were smart enough to have disabled all the CCTV cameras in my room," Jonathan continued, his gaze unblinking, "except for one." The laptop screen flickered to life, and within seconds it displayed a grainy video feed. The footage showed a figure moving silently across the room, Henry. The video clearly captured him entering the room, his movements furtive as he approached Jonathan's desk, the place where the wristwatch had been kept. The camera angle was just clear enough to reveal Henry's actions, his hand reaching out to take the watch. Henry's breath caught in his throat. His face drained of color as he realized what Jonathan had seen. His chest tightened, and for a split second, he wondered if he could still deny it, but the evidence was undeniable. Jonathan's eyes never left the screen. He watched the video as the room seemed to shrink, the tension mounting. The silence between them was thick, oppressive. Finally, Jonathan looked up at Henry, his gaze unwavering. "I'm going to ask you one last time, Henry," he said, his gaze never faltering. "Where is my watch?" Henry stood there, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. He had no way out now. The evidence was undeniable. The video played over and over in his mind like a nightmare, each second dragging him deeper into despair. His hands trembled at his sides as he slowly sank to his knees, his face contorted with guilt and fear. Tears welled up in his eyes, and his voice cracked as he finally spoke, his words desperate. I've pawned the watch, sir. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to steal from you, but my wife is dying of cancer. There's nothing more the doctors can do. She's fading, and He paused, his chest heaving as the tears began to flow freely, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "I needed the money. I had no choice. I was desperate to save her, to do something, anything. I thought I could get the money back. But I failed. I'm so sorry." Jonathan stood there, the anger in his eyes slowly replaced by something else, something that resembled pity, but only for a brief moment. The storm of emotions was too much to process in one go. He crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. Jonathan's gaze remained cold, his expression hardening once again. He stepped closer to Henry, his voice steady but laced with menace. "That watch cost me $340,000, he said, his tone cutting through the room like a knife. "And I need that watch back. Now. This minute." As Jonathan's words hung in the air, Henry continued to sob uncontrollably, his face buried in his hands. He was on the floor, begging for mercy, his voice breaking with every word. "Please, sir. I didn't mean it. I had no choice. I just wanted to save her. I'm so sorry. Please don't do this. Please." His pleas fell on deaf ears as Jonathan's expression remained unyielding. Just then, the door to the study creaked open, and Henry's voice was interrupted by a small, innocent voice calling out, "Dad?" Henry's first daughter, a young girl with wide eyes and a look of confusion on her face, stood in the doorway. She had come looking for her father, unaware of the tension that filled the room. Jonathan's gaze shifted from Henry to his daughter, standing in the doorway. A cold smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "What a beautiful daughter you've got here," he said, his voice smooth and filled with false admiration. "I've seen her a lot in the yard, and she's been beautiful each time. She truly is a work of art." He turned his attention to her, his eyes narrowing slightly as he asked, "What's your name, young lady?" The girl, taken aback by the tense atmosphere in the room, hesitated for a moment before responding. "My name is Emily," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. Jonathan nodded slowly, his eyes now sizing her up. "And how old are you, Emily?" Emily looked at her father briefly before answering, a little unsure of the situation. "I'm 23 years old," she replied, her voice still calm but clearly unsettled by the tension around her. Jonathan smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. He turned to Henry with a slight tilt of his head. "Wow, you have such a beautiful daughter," he said, his tone suddenly sharp, mocking. "I wonder if she knows that her father is a thief." The words hung in the air like a bomb, and the atmosphere in the room thickened. Henry looked down, unable to meet his daughter's gaze, as the weight of Jonathan's words settled on him. Henry, unsure of how to respond, stammered, "Thank you, sir. Please forgive me, sir." He looked at his daughter, his heart sinking as the weight of Jonathan's words hung in the air. Emily, standing frozen at the doorway, looked between her father and Jonathan, her confusion growing by the second. "A thief?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with disbelief. "My father? A thief? My father is many things, but not a thief. I don't understand what's happening." Jonathan watched her carefully, his lips curling into a subtle smile as he saw the turmoil in Emily's eyes. "Don't worry," he said smoothly, dismissing the tension in the room with a flick of his hand. "You can forget about the watch." "But—" He paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch, before his voice took on a more serious tone. "I'm going to need you to do me a very big favor." Henry, eager to salvage the situation, immediately responded, his voice pleading. "I'll do anything, sir. All you have to do is ask." Jonathan looked at him with a sharp, calculating gaze. "Anything?" he asked, his voice measured and filled with authority. Henry nodded quickly, desperation creeping into his tone. "Yes, anything, sir. Just name it." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk as he considered his words carefully. After a beat, he spoke again, his tone dropping to something more serious. "I want an heir to my fortress," he said, his eyes locked on Henry. "I'm no longer young, and I want a child to take over when I'm gone. I want Emily to give me that heir." Henry's eyes widened as the words hit him like a blow. "What? What are you asking?" he stammered, his voice trembling now. Jonathan's gaze never wavered. "Give me your daughter's hand in marriage," he said coldly. "By this evening, we will be married. Agree, and I will forget the watch. Refuse, and you will spend the rest of your days in prison." The air in the room grew thick with tension as Henry stood frozen, unable to respond at first. The weight of Jonathan's ultimatum settled heavily on him. His mind raced, but the room seemed to close in around him, his thoughts clouded by the gravity of Jonathan's demand. Henry's face flushed with anger, his chest rising and falling with each sharp breath. He shook his head vehemently, his voice rising with the intensity of his refusal. "Never," he spat, his voice full of conviction. "I would never agree to such a thing. I'd rather die than allow this." He stood tall, despite the fear gnawing at him, his fists clenched by his sides. "I've been your gardener since I was a boy, Jonathan," he continued, his voice trembling with emotion but steady in its defiance. "I served your father before you. I know what kind of man you've become, ruthless, cold, and heartless." Jonathan watched him, unblinking, his gaze as steely as ever. But Henry wasn't finished. "Over my dead body would I let my daughter marry someone like you?" Henry's voice cracked with a mix of rage and desperation, his eyes locking with Jonathan's. The weight of his words hung in the air, a challenge that Jonathan had to answer. As Henry's words hung in the air, filled with anger and defiance, the door to the study creaked open. Henry's 5-year-old second daughter, Lily, skipped into the room, her small voice ringing out as she called to her older sister. "Emily, I've been waiting for you guys outside. What's keeping you?" she asked, her voice filled with innocent curiosity. She stopped in the doorway, her wide eyes taking in the scene before her. Emily quickly turned to her, a sense of alarm flashing across her face. But before she could say anything, Lily took a few more steps into the room, unaware of the tension that hung thick in the air. Jonathan's gaze shifted to the young girl as she entered, his expression unreadable. He took in Lily's presence for a moment, a slight flicker of something behind his eyes before his focus returned to Henry. Henry turned sharply towards Jonathan, his eyes blazing with determination. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, but his voice remained unwavering. "My decision is final, Jonathan," he said, each word heavy with finality. "You are not marrying my daughter. I would rather die than see her bound to a man like you." His words hung in the air, sharp and resolute. He wasn't backing down, not for the threat, not for the wealth, and certainly not for the ruthless man standing before him. His heart ached at the thought of what Jonathan was asking, but he would never allow Emily to be subjected to such a fate. Lily, still oblivious to the full weight of the conversation, stood by Emily's side, her innocent gaze moving between the two men, trying to understand what had just transpired. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression cool, almost bored as he stared at Henry. "It can't be that bad, Henry," he said, his voice smooth, trying to downplay the situation. "I mean, you've just done a terrible thing. You stole my watch, but I'm giving you a way out here. It can't be that bad. You're not really going to refuse, are you?" He watched Henry closely, as though he expected him to crumble under the pressure. But Henry, despite the sweat on his brow and the weight of the situation pressing down on him, stood firm. His eyes were filled with a defiance that burned bright, unwilling to bend to Jonathan's will. "Any other terrible thing is better than giving you my daughter's hand in marriage," Henry said, his voice filled with conviction. The words were not just a refusal, but a rejection of the man Jonathan had become, cold, calculating, and merciless. "You'll never have her. I'd rather rot in jail than let you marry my daughter." Jonathan's voice grew more measured, a sense of calm settling in as he leaned forward, eyes locked on Henry. "Let's not make hasty and selfish decisions now, Henry," he said smoothly, almost coaxing. "I mean, think about this very carefully. If you go to jail, who's going to take care of your two beautiful daughters? You have a sick wife, remember?" He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing, his voice lower but carrying a sharp edge. "What if she doesn't make it? You yourself said she's about to die. What if she dies, Henry? Who's going to look after your daughters then? You're going to leave them in this world by themselves." Jonathan's gaze never left Henry's face, and his words dripped with calculated manipulation. "That's pretty selfish, if you ask me." The silence stretched out as Jonathan's words settled in, leaving a heavy sense of doubt in the air. Henry stood frozen, his thoughts a whirlwind, torn between his loyalty to his family and the devastating choices laid before him. Jonathan's voice remained smooth, almost too calm as he continued, his words sinking into the tension-filled room like a dagger. "Henry, there truly are worse fates in this life," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, calculating. "But the worst of it all is letting yourself end up in jail. I mean, think about it. Your daughter would have a good life with me. Look at all the wealth she would have access to. Don't be foolish." He leaned back in his chair, his tone softening as he spoke with false kindness. "I'm willing to let this whole wristwatch issue go away, Henry. I'm willing to forgive it. But here's the thing. I'm willing to marry your daughter. Who, by the way, is poor. She comes from nothing, but I think she has good genes. She's healthy, young, beautiful, and intelligent. She would carry my heir beautifully." Jonathan paused for a moment, his eyes cold as he studied Henry's face. "This could be the opportunity of a lifetime for her, Henry. Don't you see? I'm offering her everything." Henry's voice was steady, though his heart raced with a mix of anger and frustration. He looked Jonathan in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "Money is not everything, Jonathan," he replied firmly, his words cutting through the air. Jonathan stood up, his chair scraping against the floor as he did so. His eyes were cold, filled with the certainty of someone who had made up their mind. "But it is, though," he said, his voice smooth, almost patronizing. "It is why you may lose your wife, Henry. It's why I will marry Emily today." He paused, letting the words sink in, before adding with finality, "I haven't got time to waste, Henry. Chop chop, tick-tock." Jonathan took a few steps toward the door, turning back to Henry with a look of quiet menace. "I'll be in the garden in 2 hours," he said, his voice steady and cold. "I'll go upstairs now and call the marriage officiant. If I don't see Emily in the garden in 2 hours, expect the police at your doorstep today." His gaze hardened, and he gave a small, almost mocking smile. "And oh, you'll be our witness. You can bring little Lily along too, for the plot." With that, Jonathan turned on his heel, leaving Henry standing there, paralyzed by the weight of the threat hanging in the air. Henry stood frozen, his mind racing. Time was slipping away, and every second felt like an eternity. Less than 2 hours. The weight of the situation, the choices that lay before him, suffocated him. He didn't want to lose his daughter to Jonathan's manipulative game, but what choice did he have? He could already feel the tight grip of fear closing around him. Before he could voice another protest, Emily stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "I'll marry him, Dad." Henry's eyes widened in shock. "What? No, you can't," he started, his voice filled with disbelief. But Emily shook her head, cutting him off. Her expression was serious, unwavering. "I'll marry him," she repeated firmly. "Remember what you always said, Dad. There's a silver lining in every cloud. This could change all our lives, and you do not have to worry." She took a deep breath before adding softly, "I never believed in love anyway. This doesn't change anything for me." Henry felt his chest tighten. His daughter was willingly stepping into the jaws of a trap, but there was nothing he could do to stop her. Emily had made up her mind. 2 hours later, the garden was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, the soft breeze carrying the scent of fresh flowers from the surrounding trees. The grass beneath their feet was lush and green, and the soft hum of nature filled the space, a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. There were no guests, no fanfare, just the few of them standing together in the fading light. Emily stood at the altar, her gaze unwavering as she looked at Jonathan, the man she was about to marry. The dress she wore was simple yet elegant, a soft ivory fabric that flowed gently with the breeze, hugging her slender frame. Her hair was styled in soft waves, a few stray locks falling delicately around her face. But it was her expression that told the most. She was calm, composed, her decision made long before this moment. Jonathan stood tall beside her, his dark suit perfectly tailored, exuding a quiet power. His eyes were fixed on Emily, though they held something else, a calculated determination, a sense of ownership. His face was sharp, his features clean and handsome, but there was a coldness in his gaze, a distance that made it clear that this was a transaction in his eyes, not a union of hearts. Henry stood at the back, his arms crossed in front of his chest, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. His mind was still racing, trying to reconcile the decision Emily had made. He had tried to protect her, tried to shield her from this fate, but here they were. He couldn't bring himself to look at Jonathan, not after everything that had transpired. His daughter was now bound to this man, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Lily, his 5-year-old daughter, stood at Henry's side, tugging at the hem of his shirt, her wide eyes filled with confusion. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew something was wrong. She looked up at her father, seeking reassurance, but Henry could only offer her a sad smile, his heart breaking for her innocence lost. The officiant, a quiet and unassuming man, stood at the front, his words simple and to the point. The ceremony was brief, and the silence between them was thick with unspoken emotions. He spoke of vows, of commitment, but the words felt hollow, as if they were being recited from a script neither Emily nor Jonathan had truly written. "Do you, Emily, take Jonathan to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the officiant asked, his voice gentle. Emily's gaze never wavered from Jonathan's as she spoke softly but firmly. "I do." Jonathan's lips curled into a small, almost predatory smile as he responded, "I do." With the exchange of rings, the ceremony was complete, and the officiant declared them husband and wife. Emily stood still for a moment, the weight of the words settling on her. Jonathan stepped forward, lifting her chin slightly with a finger, and kissed her lightly on the lips. The kiss was brief, more a formality than anything, and Emily pulled away just as quickly. As they turned to face Henry, there was an awkward silence before Jonathan spoke, his voice cool and matter-of-fact. "You've done well, Henry," he said, his gaze lingering on Emily as he spoke. "This is for the best." Emily didn't meet her father's eyes. She kept her head down, unsure of how to reconcile her actions with her love for him. The ride back was silent. The only sound the steady hum of the scooter's engine and the occasional rustle of Lily's hair in the wind. Henry's eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but his mind was elsewhere, distant, lost in the turmoil of everything that had just happened. Lily sat behind him, her small hands gripping the edges of his jacket, her quiet presence a silent reminder of the life he had failed to protect. Henry could feel the weight of defeat pressing on his shoulders, the crushing guilt that gnawed at him with every mile. He had tried to shield Emily, tried to keep her from this fate, but now all he had was the hollow ache of knowing he had failed her. And worse, he had failed his family. His heart felt like it was being torn in two, the tears welling up in his eyes before he could stop them. He blinked hard, but it didn't help. The tears began to fall freely, rolling down his weathered face, each drop a silent testament to the devastation of the moment. Lily didn't ask him what was wrong. She could feel the sadness radiating off him, but she was too young to understand the weight of it all. She simply stayed quiet, her small arms wrapped around him, offering the only comfort she knew how. When they finally arrived home, Henry cut the engine, his mind a blur of thoughts, and they walked inside. But the moment he stepped through the door, his phone buzzed with a new message. He opened it with trembling hands, the text causing his chest to tighten even more. "It is better if you do not show up at work anymore. I will help cover your wife's remaining medical expenses and Lily's welfare. I will also take care of Emily. She is, after all, my wife. But your job at the estate is done. Do not drop by, or you will be kicked out. Emily can come visit after she has borne a son for me." The words burned through Henry, each sentence a fresh cut, a reminder of everything he had lost. He stood there, holding the phone in his shaking hand, his mind struggling to make sense of the coldness, the finality of the message. Jonathan's words were clear, decisive, and filled with a ruthlessness that made Henry's blood run cold. He wasn't just dismissed from his job. He was cast aside, his presence no longer needed. Emily, his daughter, and his family, everything had been stolen from him in a single afternoon, and now Jonathan was asserting his dominance with the most brutal finality. The promise of money for Lily and the vague hope for Emily's welfare couldn't ease the crushing feeling in Henry's chest. He had lost his job, his dignity, and most painfully, the future he had hoped for his daughter. Lily tugged at his sleeve, unaware of the storm swirling inside him. "Dad, what does it say?" she asked innocently. Henry wiped the tears from his eyes, swallowing hard before he could answer. "It's nothing, Lily," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. Just a message." He slid the phone into his pocket, his heart heavy as he looked at his daughter. She didn't need to see him like this. Not now, not ever. He couldn't let her feel the full weight of their loss, not yet. But deep down, he knew they were both standing on the edge of a new, painful reality. The silence in the room was suffocating, the weight of everything pressing down on Henry's chest. The message from Jonathan still lingered in his mind, each word echoing through his thoughts like a relentless drumbeat. But before he could collect his thoughts, his phone rang again, the sound slicing through the air like a cruel reminder that there was no escaping the pain. He stared at the screen, his hand trembling as he saw the hospital's name flash before his eyes. His heart sank. A tightness gripped his throat as he answered, his voice barely a whisper. "Hello?" The nurse's voice on the other end was calm, but it felt like it was coming from a far-off place. "Mr. Williams, I'm calling to inform you that your wife, Margaret, she passed away a short while ago. We did everything we could, but I'm sorry, sir." The world stopped. Henry's heart seemed to freeze in his chest, the words crashing into him like a tidal wave. He could hear the nurse's voice on the other end, but it was distant, muffled. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the room around him spun. He had been too late to save her. Everything he had done, all the choices he had made, trying to save her, trying to find a way, had been for nothing. The phone slipped from his hand, the screen darkening as it hit the floor with a soft thud. Henry stood motionless for a few seconds, his mind failing to process the weight of the news. His wife, the woman he had promised to protect, to save, was gone, and he hadn't been there for her in the end. He hadn't been able to keep his promise. Tears began to well in his eyes, but it was more than that. His entire body trembled as a wave of grief swept over him. His chest tightened, and the weight of his failure crushed him. He dropped to his knees, unable to control the torrent of emotions surging through him. "No," he screamed, the sound raw and guttural, as if the pain was escaping from deep within him. "Margaret, no." He couldn't breathe. The grief, the regret, the failure, everything collided in a flood of overwhelming emotion. His cries filled the room, echoing against the walls as the pain tore through him, unstoppable. Through the haze of his sorrow, he felt a small presence beside him. Lily, his little girl, had come to him. She placed her tiny hands gently on his back, her little fingers patting softly, as if trying to comfort him. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she could feel her father's pain, and in her innocence, she tried to soothe him. Lily began to cry, her soft sobs matching his. She didn't understand the weight of the moment, but she knew her father was in pain. She cried along with him, patting his back, her little hands so small against the vast sorrow of the world her father now carried. Henry's body shook with each sob, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. This was the worst day of his life. His wife was gone, his daughter was caught in the middle of this nightmare, and he had failed both of them. The world around him felt impossibly cold, and the guilt weighed him down like a heavy, unrelenting burden. His tears mixed with Lily's, the only sound in the room, the sobs of a broken father and his helpless little girl, unable to escape the pain that now defined their lives. Back at the estate, Jonathan entered Emily's room with the news she had been dreading but never expected to hear. His face was smooth, a mask of controlled emotion, but even in his own way, he felt the weight of the moment. "Emily," he began softly, his voice calm, but it carried the subtle undertone of authority. "I'm afraid I have some bad news. Your mother has passed away." The words hung in the air, but Jonathan didn't pause to give Emily a moment to process. He watched her face for a reaction, but all he saw was a stillness, as if her mind needed to catch up with the shock. She stared at him, the reality of the words not fully sinking in yet. Jonathan stood there, just long enough to let the news settle. But his face was already shifting, his eyes flickering with an impatience that spoke louder than any emotion. "I know this is difficult," he continued, his voice low and steady, "but take the time you need. I'll leave you alone for now, so you can grieve in privacy." And with that, he turned on his heel, his footsteps echoing as he left the room, his mind already back on himself, on his own priorities. Despite the small gesture of compassion, it was clear Jonathan's nature would always place himself first. He cared little for the emotional turmoil Emily was going through. What mattered was that she would adapt to her new life as his wife. The door clicked shut, and for the first time in a long while, Emily was left alone. The weight of her grief hit her then, like a tidal wave, pulling her down into the depths of loss. She sank to the floor, her knees buckling under the sudden onslaught of emotion. She let herself cry, the tears flowing freely as the reality of her mother's death and her forced marriage to Jonathan consumed her. Alone, far from the family she once knew, Emily mourned in the solitude of her new life. The mansion, grand as it was, felt empty, its walls closing in on her as the grief wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. She had no one left. Her father was lost to her, and now her mother was gone. The family she had once held dear was slipping away, leaving her isolated in a life she never chose. The more she cried, the more her hatred for Jonathan grew. He was the reason her world had been turned upside down, the man who had shattered her family. She felt trapped, forced into a life with a man who saw her as little more than a prize to claim. And as the tears continued to fall, the hatred she harbored for him became more intense, a fire that would only grow as the days passed. Emily's sobs echoed in the empty room, and as her tears dried, the bitterness in her heart began to harden. She would never forgive Jonathan for what he had done, for the pain he had caused. Her love for her family, for her mother, would remain, but in the deep, quiet corners of her soul, resentment began to take root. The day of Margaret's burial arrived, and for Emily, it was a day that would haunt her forever. She stood in her room, staring out the window, her heart heavy with grief. Her mother, the woman who had raised her, the woman who had always been there, was now gone, and she would never be able to say goodbye. When Emily approached Jonathan, her eyes red from crying, her voice breaking as she asked, "Please, Jonathan, please let me go. Let me bury my mother. Let me say goodbye." Jonathan, standing in the doorway, barely glanced at her. His expression remained impassive, indifferent to her pain. "Bear me a son first," he said, his voice cold. "Then you can go anywhere you like." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. "What?" she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "What do you mean, Jonathan? My mother is dead. This is my last chance to see her. Please, let me go." Jonathan's eyes flicked to hers, but there was no empathy in them, only a calculated coldness. "That's the contract I have with your father. You are no prisoner here, but a deal is a deal. Bear me a son, and then you have my permission to grieve however you wish." Emily's hands trembled as she fought back the urge to scream. "Please, Jonathan, please. I'm begging you, I need to be with her." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Jonathan remained unmoved, his words final. "The deal stands. You're free to leave once you've given me an heir. Until then, you will stay here, and you will obey the agreement. There's no other way." Emily's chest tightened, the weight of his words crushing her spirit. She could feel her mother's memory slipping further away, and there was nothing she could do about it. She fell to her knees, tears flowing freely as the pain of losing her mother, coupled with the cold, heartless demands of Jonathan, overwhelmed her. She was trapped, bound by a deal made by her father, with no escape, no way to honor the woman who had given her life. The world felt dark, suffocating, and she hated Jonathan more with each passing second. And so, with her heart broken in ways she never thought possible, Emily could not say her final goodbyes to her mother. The woman who had meant everything to her, the woman who had been her strength, was now gone, and Emily was left in this estate with no way out. Her hatred for Jonathan grew, each passing day deepening the resentment in her heart. She would never forgive him for this, for taking her away from her mother, for making her feel as though she was nothing but a pawn in his cruel game. The pain of not being able to mourn her mother, to honor her in the way she deserved, would stay with her for the rest of her life. It was one of those days when the weight of everything felt too much to bear. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the scent of rain, and the garden, once a place of solace, now felt like a prison. Emily walked slowly, her mind consumed with 1,000 thoughts, none of them pleasant. Her mother's death, Jonathan's relentless demands, the life she had been forced into, it was all too much. She had spent the morning crying in her room, and though the tears had stopped flowing, the emptiness remained. There was no comfort to be found in this mansion, not in the ornate walls or the cold luxury that surrounded her. She needed a break, an escape, however small it might be. As she wandered into the garden, her eyes scanned the lush green space, the colorful flowers and the neatly trimmed bushes. She could hear the distant chirp of birds, but it felt muffled in her chest, like everything around her was dimmed by the grief that clouded her mind. She sank down onto one of the stone benches, resting her elbows on her knees and staring at the ground, lost in the silence of her thoughts. Just as she tried to gather herself, she heard footsteps behind her, firm, deliberate. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Jonathan. Emily, his voice, low and even, broke the silence. She sighed inwardly, but didn't answer. She wasn't in the mood for any more of his cold, businesslike conversation. She had had enough of his demands, his coldness, his manipulations. But Jonathan wasn't one to let things go easily. "You look like you could use a drink," he said, his tone almost casual. "Lemonade, maybe?" Emily hesitated, her instincts telling her to refuse, to push him away. But in that moment, she realized how utterly exhausted she was. Mentally, physically, days passed, and though Emily tried to dismiss the brief moment of connection she had shared with Jonathan in the garden, she couldn't help but reflect on it. His words kept coming back to her, the quiet vulnerability that she had never expected from him. It disturbed her, in a way. She had always seen him as a ruthless businessman, someone who controlled everything around him with his wealth and power. But in that moment, she saw something else. A man who was trapped just as she was. She hated that she could see the cracks in his armor, that she could feel a small, reluctant understanding creeping into her heart. She didn't want to care about him. She couldn't. But as the days went on, and as Jonathan continued his small, seemingly insignificant gestures of kindness, bringing her books, letting her have time alone, making sure she had everything she needed, she found herself softening just a little. It was so subtle at first that Emily didn't notice it right away. When Jonathan spoke to her, she didn't feel the immediate need to shut him down. She was still angry, still bitter, but she wasn't as quick to push him away. And when he asked if she was all right after a long day, she would find herself answering honestly, not out of obligation, but because in those brief moments, she didn't feel so alone. Emily had gone for a walk earlier that afternoon to clear her mind, but now, as the storm raged around her, she regretted it. Her clothes clung to her skin, soaked through, her hair matted to her face. The weight of the grief she had carried for so long, the anger, the confusion, everything she'd been bottling up, seemed to intensify in the downpour. She found herself trudging along the dirt path, her steps slow and heavy as she fought to ignore the chill seeping into her bones. The estate, so far from any town, seemed even more isolated in the storm. She had hoped for some solitude, but now, all she wanted was to escape, to find comfort somewhere, anywhere. Jonathan, of course, had other plans. Emily didn't notice the car pulling up beside her at first. She was too lost in her own thoughts. But when she heard the engine shut off, she turned to find Jonathan's car parked beside her, the headlights illuminating her drenched figure. He rolled down the window, his face a mixture of concern and impatience. "What the hell are you doing out here in this storm?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. His eyes scanned her, taking in her soaked appearance. He didn't wait for an answer before he opened the door and stepped out, his suit already drenched. "Get in the car, Emily. You're freezing." She wanted to refuse, to snap at him for interfering, but she couldn't summon the energy. Instead, she found herself silently walking to the car, barely able to comprehend how exhausted she felt. She slid into the passenger seat, the warmth of the car enveloping her, though it didn't seem to chase away the cold from her bones. Jonathan said nothing as he started the engine, focusing on the road as they drove back to the mansion. Emily stared out the window, her mind still spinning. She had barely spoken a word, too overwhelmed to form a coherent thought. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't familiar either. For the first time, she didn't want to argue with him. When they arrived at the mansion, Jonathan guided her inside, not saying a word, but his actions spoke volumes. He handed her a dry towel and motioned for her to sit by the fire. "Stay here. I'll get you something warm," he said, his voice gentler than usual. Emily sat by the fire, her body trembling with the cold as she wrapped the towel around her shoulders. She was exhausted, emotionally and physically, and the exhaustion soon overtook her. As she sat there alone with her thoughts, she realized just how much she had been holding in. She wanted to scream, to cry, to let it all out. But she was too afraid of how she might seem, too afraid of losing the last shred of control she had over herself. Jonathan returned moments later, a steaming mug of tea in his hand. He sat down next to her, the quiet presence of his company filling the space between them. Without saying anything, he handed her the tea. "Go ahead," he said softly, his voice low and comforting. "You need it." Emily took the cup, the warmth spreading through her hands, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself relax. She closed her eyes for a moment, then, slowly, began to sip the tea. The silence stretched on, but this time, it felt different. The fire crackled in the background, casting a soft glow over the room. Emily felt herself sinking into the warmth of the moment, no longer focused on her anger, her grief, her fears. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel the need to keep up her guard. She let herself breathe, let the tension leave her body. Jonathan, sitting across from her, finally spoke, his voice more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. "You know," he began, his gaze focused on the fire. "I never really had a childhood. My father, he was never around, and when he was, he didn't have time for me. It was always about the business, the estate. He never taught me how to love, how to connect with people." Emily looked up at him, surprised by his words. Jonathan was still Jonathan, the wealthy, powerful man who had forced her into this life. But for a brief moment, she saw a glimpse of the boy he had once been, the man who had never known the kind of family she had taken for granted. "I never knew what it was like to have a real family," Jonathan continued, his voice quieter now. "All I knew was the business, the legacy, the pressure. It's a lonely life, Emily, and I've been living it for so long that I don't know how to change." Emily listened, the bitterness in her heart slowly giving way to something softer, sympathy. She could see the cracks in Jonathan's facade now, the loneliness he had carried for years. The walls he had built around himself had been too strong for anyone to breach, and it had made him the man he was today. The ruthlessness, the control, maybe they were all just a defense mechanism, built to protect a heart that had never been given the chance to feel. "You don't know what it's like to have a family," Emily whispered, more to herself than to him. "To have someone who loves you, just for being you, not for what you can give them." Jonathan turned to look at her then, his gaze softening for the first time. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't." And in that moment, Emily felt something shift inside her. She didn't know if it was forgiveness, she wasn't ready for that yet, but she could feel something different, something she hadn't expected. Jonathan had allowed himself to be vulnerable with her, and in doing so, he had cracked the armor that she had always seen. For the first time, Emily felt something other than hatred for him. The cold, impenetrable walls around her heart began to thaw ever so slightly. The estate was buzzing with activity the next day. A formal dinner was being held, with some of Jonathan's closest business associates in attendance. The grand hall was filled with the clinking of glasses, the murmur of polite conversation, and the rustle of evening gowns and tuxedos. Jonathan had spent most of the night mingling, his usual charm on full display. Emily had kept to herself, lingering near the edges of the room, quietly observing, still not fully comfortable in this world that felt so foreign to her. She hadn't expected much from the evening, but what happened next would leave her reeling. A man, one of Jonathan's associates, who she had only met once or twice before, approached her with a sly smile, his words dripping with unwanted familiarity. "Emily," he began, his voice low but insistent, "I can't help but admire your beauty tonight. You're a rare sight in a place like this." She smiled stiffly, trying to maintain composure, but the compliment felt more like an invasion. The man's hand brushed against her arm, just a little too lingering, and she took a step back instinctively. "I'm flattered, but I'm afraid I'm not interested," she said, trying to move away without making a scene. But he didn't take the hint. "Come now, Emily," he pressed, his tone darkening just slightly. "You're Jonathan's wife, aren't you? Surely you know what it's like to be desired. Don't act so innocent with me." The discomfort Emily had been feeling all evening bloomed into something more dangerous. She glanced around the room, hoping to find someone to help, but most of the guests were too engrossed in their own conversations to notice. The man took another step toward her, a predatory gleam in his eye, and Emily took another step back. "Please, I don't think you should be speaking to me like this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Before the man could respond, Jonathan appeared out of nowhere, his presence suddenly filling the space. His gaze locked on the man with a fierceness that sent a chill through the room. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his body between Emily and the business associate, his voice cutting through the tension. "That's enough," Jonathan said, his tone commanding. There was no room for argument in his voice. "You will apologize to my wife right now." The man blinked in surprise, but he quickly straightened himself, realizing that he had crossed a line. "Jonathan?" he began, but Jonathan cut him off, his glare now colder than anything Emily had ever seen. "I don't want to hear another word," Jonathan said, his voice low but sharp. "Apologize, or you'll never set foot in this estate again." The man's face flushed with embarrassment, and after a tense moment of silence, he muttered, "I'm sorry, Emily." The apology felt empty, but it was enough to make the situation diffuse. Jonathan didn't wait for the man's explanation. He simply turned his back on him and walked Emily away from the scene, his hand gently placed at her back. They made their way to a quiet corner of the room, away from the crowd. Jonathan turned to Emily, his eyes softer now, but the intensity of his actions still hanging in the air. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice almost unrecognizable in its concern. Emily nodded slowly, her heart racing, but not from fear anymore. The moment had been brief, but it had shaken her, in more ways than she could understand. For the first time, she realized that Jonathan wasn't just a man who controlled her life. He was someone who would protect her when she needed it most. Jonathan didn't wait for her response. He simply moved to stand beside her, his presence offering an unexpected comfort. "I won't let anyone treat you that way again," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "You're mine to protect, Emily." Emily, still processing the rush of emotions, couldn't help but feel a flicker of warmth at his words. She had never expected him to defend her, not like that. There was something about the way he stepped in so effortlessly, without hesitation, that made her feel safe. And though she still struggled with everything that had happened between them, she couldn't deny the shift in her feelings. Jonathan, for all his flaws, had just shown her that he wasn't completely lost to his own ambition. She looked at him, her heart a little softer than it had been before, and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small but genuine. Jonathan gave her a brief nod, his gaze steady. "You don't need to thank me, Emily, it's just what I do." And in that moment, Emily realized something she hadn't been willing to admit before. Jonathan was also the man who would defend her, protect her, and that brought her walls down a little bit more. Emily had no idea what to expect when Jonathan had asked her to join him for dinner. She was hesitant, unsure whether it was just another of his calculated attempts to win her over, or if there was something more to it. But she had agreed, unwilling to refuse him outright, though the reservation in her heart remained. Jonathan had arranged the dinner in the garden, far from the sterile walls of the mansion. The space had been transformed into something intimate, a table set for two, with soft candlelight flickering in elegant holders. Lanterns were strung through the branches of the trees, casting a warm golden glow that made the garden feel like something out of a dream. The air was cool, with a gentle breeze that made the leaves dance and the light from the candles shimmer. It was, in every way, the opposite of the cold, transactional relationship they had shared thus far. Emily stood just inside the garden, taking in the beauty of the setup. The flowers around them were in full bloom, their colors vibrant under the fading light of day. A small orchestra of distant sounds from nature filled the air. Everything was designed to make the evening feel personal, meaningful. Jonathan stood waiting at the table, his suit dark and sharp, but there was something softer about his posture tonight. His gaze softened as she approached, the usual command in his expression replaced by something else, a warmth that caught her off guard. "You look beautiful tonight, Emily," he said, his voice sincere. He pulled out the chair for her to sit, an uncommon gesture that made her pause for a moment. Emily hesitated, sitting down carefully, still unsure of his intentions, but the scene before her, so different from the cold, transactional dinners they usually had, was hard to ignore. There was a genuine atmosphere in the air, something she hadn't expected from Jonathan. The dinner began quietly, the conversation flowing easily as they ate, and for the first time in a long while, Emily found herself listening, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The food was delicious, the wine rich and smooth. Jonathan made sure the evening unfolded in a way that felt natural, the conversation light but intimate. The usual tension that plagued their interactions seemed to melt away, and though Emily had prepared herself to remain distant, she felt something inside her start to shift. Jonathan wasn't being his usual controlling self. He was being genuine. After they finished their meal, Jonathan stood raising his glass. Emily, still unsure, followed his lead and lifted her own. "To you, Emily," Jonathan said, his voice firm but warm. "To the woman who has proven time and time again that she is far more than anyone could have imagined. You've shown strength, resilience, and grace in ways I never thought possible. You've made an impression on me, one that I will not forget." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure how to respond to this uncharacteristic display of vulnerability from him. The man who had once seemed like nothing more than an arrogant, calculating stranger had just given her the most genuine toast she'd ever received. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice a little unsteady, unsure of what exactly to say. She had expected more manipulation, more of his usual calculated actions. But instead, there was a raw honesty in his words. It made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her heart ache instead of shut down. Jonathan looked at her with a mixture of sincerity and something else, respect, perhaps, or admiration. "I know I've made mistakes, Emily," he continued, his voice quieter now. "I know I can be difficult, but I want you to know that I respect you. You don't have to be anything for me, but who you are." The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket, warm and unexpected. It was the first time in a long while that she had heard someone speak to her like this, like she mattered for who she was, not what she could provide or what was expected of her. They shared a quiet moment in the soft glow of the garden, the warmth of the evening wrapping around them both as they sipped their wine. Emily looked at Jonathan, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw a man who wasn't just a figure of power or control. He was someone who, in his own way, was trying to do better, trying to offer her something more than what she had expected. As the evening wore on, Emily felt a subtle shift in her heart, a softening that she couldn't quite explain. The man before her wasn't perfect, but in that moment, he had shown her a side of him she hadn't thought possible. The walls she had built around herself, so carefully constructed over the years, began to show cracks. She didn't know if it was love yet, but for the first time, she felt something genuine between them, something she hadn't thought she would ever feel. Days passed, and though things between Jonathan and Emily had shifted, there remained an undeniable tension in the air, one neither of them could fully ignore. Jonathan, who had been wrestling with his feelings for her, finally decided that the time had come to make his feelings known. He couldn't keep hiding behind the walls he had built for so long. The love he had tried so desperately to suppress had only grown stronger with each passing day, each shared moment between them. One evening, as the sky grew dim and the estate settled into a soft, quiet lull, Jonathan asked Emily to meet him in his study. She was hesitant, unsure of what to expect, but she agreed nonetheless, knowing that whatever this was, it would be a turning point. As she entered the study, the room was filled with a certain heaviness. Jonathan stood by the large window, looking out at the grounds, his back to her. When he turned to face her, Emily could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the vulnerability he usually kept hidden. "Emily," Jonathan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "there's something I need to tell you." He paused, collecting his thoughts before speaking again, his words more fragile than he had intended. "I've fallen in love with you." The confession hung in the air like a weight, and Emily's breath caught in her chest. She had prepared herself for many things, but not this. Jonathan, the man who had once been nothing more than a cold, calculating figure, was now standing before her, openly admitting his feelings. "I know this may seem sudden," Jonathan continued, his voice softer now, "and I know I've made mistakes, but I can't pretend anymore. I love you, Emily. And I've realized that I don't want you to stay because of the contract, because of the obligation. I want you to stay because you feel the same way, because you want to. That's the only way it matters to me now." He reached for the drawer of his desk, pulling out the marriage certificate, the very symbol of the contract that had bound them together. He held it in his hands, the paper trembling slightly, as he looked at Emily, his gaze full of sincerity. "I'm breaking the contract," he said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "I'm tearing it up, because I want you to have the choice. You're free to leave, Emily, and if you decide to stay, it will be because you feel the same way, not because of any deal I made with your father. I'm taking a huge risk here. I'm throwing away the dream of having an heir, the legacy I've worked so hard for. But I don't care anymore. I want you, Emily." He held the certificate in front of her, then, without a moment's hesitation, he tore it in half. The sound of the paper ripping echoed in the room, but it felt as though something else had torn between them. An invisible bond, one that had kept them trapped in a marriage of convenience. "I'm scared," Jonathan admitted quietly, his voice breaking just slightly. "But I'd rather risk everything than live without knowing if you feel the same." Emily stood there, frozen. Her heart ached for him. She could see the depth of his feelings, his vulnerability laid bare before her. She knew he was taking a tremendous risk, one that could cost him everything he had built. But as she looked at him, something shifted within her, something she couldn't ignore. For a moment there was a brief, painful silence as Emily tried to process his words, his sacrifice. Her heart ached, torn between what she felt for him and the reality of her own emotions. She felt for him deeply. She had come to understand him in ways she never thought possible. She saw the pain, the loneliness he had carried for so long, and she felt a rush of sympathy for him. But love, true love, was something she couldn't force, no matter how much she wished she could. She cared for him, more than she had ever imagined, but she didn't feel the same way he did. Not yet, not in the way he needed her to. "Jonathan," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I care for you, I understand you, and I'm grateful to see this side of you, the human side. But I don't feel the same. Not in the way you do. I can't stay with you like this, not when my heart doesn't match yours." The words were like a dagger to Jonathan's chest. He didn't speak right away, his face pale as the weight of her rejection sank in. His heart broke at her words, the pain evident in his eyes. But he nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line, accepting her decision, though it crushed him. "I understand," he said, his voice quiet, filled with the kind of sorrow that could only come from losing something he had hoped for with all his heart. Emily's heart wrenched as she saw the defeat in his eyes. She wanted to stay. She wanted to find a way to love him, to make this work, but she couldn't. Not when she knew that her heart was not yet ready to follow his. With one final, lingering look, she turned and walked out of the study, leaving Jonathan standing there, holding the pieces of a dream he had just let go. Emily's mind was a whirlwind as she drove back home, the wind whipping through the open window, but it couldn't clear the thoughts that clung to her like a thick fog. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Jonathan's car behind her, chasing her down, trying to convince her to come back. But there was nothing, just the empty stretch of road behind her. Did I want him to follow me? Her heart pounded as she questioned herself, the ache of leaving him still heavy in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was scared that he might come after her, or if, deep down, she secretly hoped he would. Her emotions were torn, conflicting, and she couldn't make sense of them. The weight of Jonathan's confession, his vulnerability, had shaken her, but the reality of his love wasn't something she could return just yet. She had made the decision. She needed to return to her family, to the life she knew, away from the complexities of Jonathan and his world. The thought of his face, his broken heart when she walked away, kept haunting her. Had I made the right decision? The question gnawed at her, but she refused to let herself dwell on it for long. She needed to focus. Focus on her family. Focus on the life she had left behind. When she finally arrived at her family's home, the familiar sight of her father and sister waiting for her brought a flood of relief. It was everything she had needed, her family. The simple, comforting routine of their lives, free from the chaos and emotional turmoil she had left behind at the estate. Her father's warm embrace and Lily's bright smile were the things that grounded her. She felt herself breathe easier in their presence, the tension in her chest melting away. They spent the evening together, laughing and talking as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't just made the hardest decision of her life. They ate together, their home filled with the familiar smells of her mother's cooking, their voices filling the space with life. Lily pulled out a box of music, and soon enough the house was alive with the sound of their old favorite songs. They danced around the living room, not caring about the world outside, wrapped in the warmth of their family's love. Emily laughed, the joy of being back with them washing over her like a soothing balm. It was everything she needed: comfort, love, familiarity. But even in the midst of their joy, Jonathan lingered in her thoughts. Was he okay? The question came to her mind despite the effort she made to push it away. The face of the man who had confessed his love for her, the man who had broken the contract for her, was impossible to forget. She had walked away from him, but in her heart, she couldn't escape him. As the days passed, Emily tried to settle back into the life she had left behind. She reconnected with old friends, helped her father with chores around the house, and spent time with Lily. Yet, despite the outward calmness of her life, there was an undercurrent of restlessness. Every time she caught herself thinking about Jonathan, she brushed it off, convincing herself that she had made the right decision. It was better this way, she told herself. She was free. She could be herself again. But the thoughts of him wouldn't leave her. They came to her in the quiet moments, in the stillness before sleep, in the echo of her heart's quiet yearning. He had touched her life in ways she couldn't fully explain. His words, his actions, how he had treated her with respect, how he had defended her, even when she was at her lowest, had all left an imprint on her soul. One night, Emily dreamt of Jonathan. In the dream, he wasn't the man who had trapped her, the man who had controlled her. He was just Jonathan, the man who had opened his heart to her, the man who had let down his walls. They were sitting together in the garden, the warmth of the sun on their skin, their hands almost touching. She could feel the weight of the unspoken words between them, the quiet connection they shared. She reached out to him, but before she could speak, she woke up. The dream was vivid, the the feeling of it still lingering as she slowly opened her eyes. The ache in her chest returned, sharper than ever. She missed him. She missed his presence, his warmth, the way he had made her feel seen, not as a wife bound by a contract, but as a person. A woman. As the days continued to pass, Emily couldn't ignore it anymore. She found herself thinking about Jonathan more and more, replaying the moments they had shared, the tenderness in his eyes, the vulnerability he had shown her. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that she had fallen in love with him. She had tried so hard to fight it, to distance herself from him, but her heart had betrayed her. Her feelings for him had evolved in ways she hadn't expected. What had started as anger, then sympathy, had slowly shifted into something more. Something real. She couldn't deny it. She loved him, and now, more than ever, she longed to be with him. But the question lingered in her mind. Was it too late? Henry watched Emily carefully, as he always had. Over the past few days, he had noticed the way she seemed distant, her eyes often far away, as though her mind was caught in a world only she could see. She would lose herself in thought, staring out the window or pacing quietly in the garden, lost in a battle he could not see. He knew that look. It was the same look her mother used to wear when they were younger, when she had fallen for him, despite all the struggles. It was the same look that came with love, with yearning, with a kind of silent, bittersweet longing that no one else could understand but the person who felt it. Henry's heart twisted as he saw the familiar signs in his daughter's eyes. She's in love, he thought, his gaze softening as he watched Emily from across the room. It didn't please him, not one bit, that the man who had captured his daughter's heart was Jonathan, the man who had shattered their family. But he had learned over the years that nothing he said could stop her from feeling what she felt. All he ever wanted for her was happiness. And it was clear to him now, with every sigh she let out and every vacant look in her eyes, that being away from Jonathan had not made her happy. It was an agonizing realization for him. He had spent so much time protecting her from the world, from men like Jonathan, hoping she would find someone who would treat her with love and respect. Yet in the quiet corners of his heart, Henry knew that love wasn't something you could control or prevent. And if Emily had found it, even with a man like Jonathan, he couldn't stand in her way. One afternoon, after a long day, Henry called Emily into the living room. The sun was setting outside, casting a soft, golden light across the room. He had been watching her carefully, waiting for the right moment to speak, but the moment was always fleeting. Today, though, something was different. Emily sat on the couch, her legs crossed, looking out the window. Her expression was distant again, and Henry knew it was time to talk. "Emily," he said gently, his voice carrying a mix of concern and care. She turned to look at him, and for a moment, their eyes locked. Henry could see the storm brewing behind her gaze. "Dad, I'm fine," Emily replied quickly, her voice tired. She didn't want to talk about it, not right now. But Henry wasn't going to let it slide. He had known his daughter long enough to see the signs. He had seen this exact look in her mother's eyes when she had fallen for him, a look that made Henry both proud and terrified. He sat down beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I know you're not fine, child," he said softly. "I raised you right with your mom to know the difference between right and wrong. And if Jonathan is what you want, if he's the one who makes your heart feel alive, then I won't stand in your way. You have to do what makes you happy." Emily's breath hitched in her chest. She opened her mouth to protest, but Henry silenced her with a gentle shake of his head. "I don't like that it's Jonathan. I don't like what he did to you, what he did to our family. But you're my daughter, and I love you. And if you believe that he's the one who can make you whole again, then go make things right. Go back to him." The words hit Emily harder than she had expected. She had been so certain that her father would never condone a reunion with Jonathan, that he would continue to warn her against him. But instead, he was telling her that he trusted her judgment, that, despite everything, he just wanted her to be happy. She blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over. "But Dad, what about you? What about everything we've been through?" Emily asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "What about everything I've sacrificed to be here, to make this right with you?" Henry's eyes softened, and he took her hand in his. I'll always be here for you, no matter what. But I won't be the one to tell you who to love. I won't stand in the way of your heart. Your mother and I raised you to make your own decisions, to choose your own path. If Jonathan is the one who can make you feel whole, then I can't take that from you." For a long moment, they sat in silence. Emily could feel the weight of her father's words pressing on her heart. He had given her his blessing, though it was clear it wasn't easy for him. But the love in his eyes was undeniable. He wanted her to find happiness, even if that meant being with Jonathan. The words Henry had spoken still echoed in Emily's mind as she hugged him tightly. She felt his arms around her, his warmth, and she knew, deep in her heart, that her father loved her enough to let her go. It wasn't easy for him, but he had seen her, really seen her, and that made all the difference. A tear slipped down her cheek, and before she could wipe it away, Henry's hand was there, gently brushing it aside. "Go, child," he whispered. "Go be happy." The words were both a blessing and a farewell. They were the last thing Emily needed to hear before she left, and though it hurt to walk away from him, she knew she was making the right choice, the only choice. She had to go to Jonathan, for herself, for the chance at something more than obligation. She wiped the last of her tears and, with a deep breath, turned toward the door. "I'll be back soon, Dad," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. Emily took a taxi, her mind racing with uncertainty. Was it too late? Was Jonathan waiting for her? She could hardly breathe as the city streets blurred by. Her thoughts were filled with images of Jonathan, his face when she had walked away, the hurt in his eyes. The feeling of him tearing up the contract, his vulnerability that had taken her by surprise. She couldn't forget the kindness, the gentleness he had shown her when she needed it most. Despite all the mistakes, despite the pain, she knew one thing for sure. Her heart had always belonged to him. "Please, don't let it be too late," she whispered to herself, closing her eyes in silent prayer. When the taxi finally pulled up to the grand estate, Emily's heart skipped a beat. She stepped out of the car, the cool evening air biting at her skin, but her nerves burned hot beneath it. Her eyes searched the grounds until they found him. Jonathan. He stood there, waiting. His back to her, his posture rigid, but as soon as their eyes met, time seemed to slow down. The distance between them felt endless. She could see the pain in his eyes, but also a flicker of hope. Hope that she had come back. Hope that she was here, right now, in front of him. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, their gazes locked, saying everything they couldn't with words. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat, the moment suspended in time. It was the moment she had been hoping for. The moment when the gap between them could finally close. And then, without warning, Jonathan was moving. He ran towards her with an urgency that took Emily's breath away. She barely had time to react before he reached her. His arms strong as he lifted her off the ground, holding her close to his chest. The world seemed to fall away, and for the first time in days, Emily felt the weight in her chest ease. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize for what she had done, for leaving him, but Jonathan wouldn't let her. His lips pressed gently to her forehead, and he whispered against her skin, "Don't say anything, just stay here in my arms." His voice was rough with emotion, but there was a tenderness there, a longing that pulled at her heart. "I never want to lose you again," Jonathan murmured, his voice thick with something raw, something real. "Thank you for coming back to me, Emily. I prayed that you would." His words wrapped around her like a warm embrace. She had feared this moment for so long, feared the weight of the decision, feared that it might be too late. But now, standing in his arms, everything felt right. The pain, the heartache, all of it melted away in the space between their hearts. She no longer felt trapped by her past, no longer burdened by the guilt of her choices. She was here with him, and that was all that mattered now. In Jonathan's arms, the world seemed to slow. Emily felt her heart beating in her chest, thudding with a rhythm that matched her emotions. All of the pent-up feelings she had buried, all the confusion, the fear, the anger, and the longing suddenly spilled out, unfiltered, raw. She looked into Jonathan's eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a freedom in speaking her truth. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she had kept inside. "I don't know how I ever got here, how I ended up in this mess, But when I left, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting myself. But all I did was make myself miserable. I hated myself for what I did to you. You showed me a side of you that I never expected, and I saw that maybe you were human, just like me." She took a deep breath, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I was so scared, so angry, and I couldn't see beyond that. But Jonathan, in my heart, in my soul, I know the truth. I love you, Jonathan, I really do." The words hung between them, filling the space with something that had been waiting to be said for so long. Jonathan's eyes softened, his chest tightening with emotion. He had heard those words before, but this time it felt different. This time it was real. Jonathan smiled softly, but his heart was racing. He had wanted to do this from the moment he had torn up the marriage contract, but he had held back, unsure of the right moment. And now, as Emily's words echoed in his ears, he knew that there would never be a better time than this. With a swift, graceful motion, Jonathan dropped to one knee before her. The world seemed to pause as he looked up at her, his heart laid bare. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never thought I would find someone like you. I never thought I would find someone who would change me, make me see the world differently. And yet, here you are." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a beautiful diamond ring. "I've already given you everything I could, but I want to give you more. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Emily, will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she looked down at Jonathan, kneeling before her. The man who had once been a stranger to her, the man who had hurt her, who had made her feel like a prisoner, was now the man who was asking for her hand in marriage. She could feel her heart beating in her chest, the weight of everything that had happened between them. And yet, the love she had for him was undeniable. She had never imagined this would be her life. But now that it was, she knew with absolute certainty she was ready. "Yes," she said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Jonathan, I will marry you." Jonathan smiled, his face lighting up with pure joy as he stood and slid the ring onto her finger. The kiss that followed was gentle, filled with the promise of a new beginning, a future where they would build something together, beyond the walls of what had once been their broken past. And so, they lived their lives, not bound by a contract, but by love, understanding, and mutual respect. Jonathan had learned to soften, to open his heart to someone else, and Emily had discovered that sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most unexpected happiness. They built a future together, one that neither of them could have anticipated, but one that was built on the foundation of trust, forgiveness, and love. If you've enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more content like this. Don't miss out on the next chapter of love, heartbreak, and everything in between. Hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. See you in the next story.